The World Conference on International Telecommunications will meet in Dubai in December 2012. One would expect that the members of the International Telecommunications Union, having experienced the benefits of liberalization, competition and innovation in the telecommunications industry, would be considering proposals that would benefit the people of our countries, particularly of the developing world, using the tools, the proven tools of competition and light-handed regulation. Unfortunately, when the proposals before the WCIT are examined, one does not get this impression. In particular, there is a very pernicious proposal coming from the European Telecom Network Operators Association, ETNO. That particular proposal, which has some echoes in some of the language that might be coming from the Arab region and also possibly the African region, though there is no absolute consensus on the subject among the African countries, involves changing the entire economic structure of how data travels across the world for the provision of internet services to people. What this means is that today, when a person in a country like Sri Lanka or Indonesia uses the internet, or for example something like Facebook or a database, they actually pay their broadband supplier, they pay their internet service provider, but they do not pay the entity at the other end that is providing them the content, except in rare instances where the material is behind a paywall. But as we all know, in most cases, we don't have paywalls operating for internet content. In particular, for the most popular sites such as YouTube or Facebook, there is no paywall. You go, you use it, and that's the end of that. What the European network, the European telecom operators, the incumbent operators, the big companies that have a history of monopolistic behavior, what they want is for the networks of the countries that host this content to pay them for carrying it. And that has tremendously dangerous implications for not only the access to information from all over the world, from developing countries in particular, but for the very process, the very momentum by which the internet is being taken up, especially by the poor in our countries. I run Learn Asia, which is a think tank that deals with a large number of countries in developing Asia and the Pacific. And we conduct, among other things, we conduct a very large sample survey, 10,000 samples, 6 countries, 12 languages, where we, and in addition we do qualitative surveys, studies. We are trying to find out what people at the bottom of the pyramid, the poor, are doing in terms of information and communication technologies, how their behavior is changing. We have been studying this since 2004. We have done 4 studies. And based on these studies, what we were beginning to see was that the last year that we did it, 2011, we were beginning to see people moving into what we call more than voice services, usually based on mobile platforms, mobile networks, mobile devices. And in many cases, what we were beginning to see is that people are just jumping right into things like Facebook. So for example, when we were doing some qualitative studies, household interviews, in-depth interviews, we found that people, when we asked them, do you use the internet? They said no. But in a little while, they would start talking about what they're doing with Facebook. So it's like they were using Facebook, but they were not using internet. Now for most people, that would be a kind of silly statement, but if you really think about it, what do these names matter? They were moving into something that was of importance to them, and everybody perhaps knows that Indonesia is today one of the world's largest users of Facebook. Perhaps the 3rd largest concentration of people using Facebook is in this country called Indonesia. So one of the things that we were asking those days is, Facebook as a company is absorbing a lot of costs in terms of server space, computing power and so on to supply these services to the people of Indonesia. And what were they getting for it, we asked, in the early days when Facebook was really catching fire in the Indonesian market. And the reason was, we said, well, they must be having some plans to develop the advertising market and so on, but we could clearly see that in the short term there wasn't a lot of money to be made from Indonesia. Now, what this proposal, what the ethno proposal will do is that it has the potential of cutting off the people in Indonesia from using Facebook. And also, you take another, now Facebook you might consider somewhat trivial, though I don't, but you could also take something like Khan Academy. There is a interesting service that has been developed by a Bangladeshi American, by Mr. Salman Khan. And this was a story. He was very good in math and he was an investment banker. He wanted to help his nephew or niece to pass some exams in mathematics. He was in the United States, his relatives were in Bangladesh. He simply turned a camera on himself. He told them how to solve certain mathematical problems and he put it on YouTube and the kids watched it and they passed their exams. Mr. Sal Khan is no longer in the investment business. He is now a greatly regarded, highly awarded social entrepreneur who runs something called Khan Academy. Now let's take the case of a young woman or a young man in the developing countries who is accessing Khan Academy in order to further their education. I have actually been talking to university administrators in our region and telling them we have to reinvent the university in the same way that we reinvented telecommunications to give low-cost, affordable telecommunication service to our people by deviating from the standard model of telephony that is found in Europe and in the United States. We have to reinvent higher education. And one of the things that I have been talking to all these people about is our innovations like Sal Khan's Khan Academy. Anybody who wants can check it out on the web. It's quite an extraordinary service that has been developed. Now the issue is this. Again, you take this young child who is accessing this information for educational purposes, and he or she or their parents will pay the internet service provider for downloading the YouTube video. But they will not pay Sal Khan anything. They do not pay the network or that carries the particular video, right? Now, what the European proposal, the ethno proposal seeks to do is to take a completely discredited, old-fashioned bilateral monopoly model of settlements or accounting rate regimes that applied and worked when we had monopolies running voice telephony in the 1970s and the 80s, and try to extend it to the internet. What this means is a principle called sending network party pays. What this means is that any network that sends data to another network will have to pay that network for the data that it sends. Now, there is something a little incongruous about this, because remember, this young child who requested the content from YouTube that Mr. Sal Khan provided through his organization called Khan Academy is sitting on a server in Europe or United States. So we don't actually know where, because these things are cached all over the place. It's sitting somewhere there. That network will have to pay to respond to a request made by a young child sitting in Sri Lanka. And they'll have to pay the network, which happens to be the internet service provider for this child. So I could even see some really perverse applications where people will start employing large numbers of young people to simply generate requests for data in other countries, so that when that data is sent to this network, they will have to pay. I don't think these things will happen, but I have seen very odd things happening in telecommunications in my life. However, so in this kind of situation, what is likely to happen? That network says it's not like the old days where we had one monopoly for each country. And you take 200 countries in the UN system, more or less, and we have to deal with 200 agreements. That's not the case anymore. Each country has got 10, 15 functioning networks, sometimes a lot more. So you can just imagine the transaction costs of entering into these agreements. You can imagine that the internet would have to be basically re-engineered so that this information actually flows so that the billing can be done. The Internet Society has made it very clear that this would mean ending the architecture of the internet as we know it. But furthermore, we have this incongruous situation where because somebody in my country's network, Sri Lanka's network, asked for information, some other network has to pay the Sri Lankan network. That's kind of absurd. That network will say, well, okay, for various reasons we'll have to pay. We'll turn around and we'll ask Mr. Salkan from the Khan Academy to pay because he's the one who's causing the problem for us. So now Salkan is a non-profit. Khan Academy is a non-profit organization. He has supporters. Mr. Bill Gates is one of his great supporters. He has money, but he doesn't have endless amounts of money and he has a certain business plan. So he will perhaps have to say, I cannot give this information away for free, I'll have to go behind a paywall. Now, he goes behind a paywall. Let's assume that this child who is accessing the information comes from a rich family and has resources. But does that child have an internationally recognized credit card in order to navigate the paywall? In my country at least, less than 10% of our population have credit cards. Less than that have internationally operable credit cards. So what would really mean is not beyond all the transaction costs, there will be a physical impossibility of actually surmounting the paywall. And our people will be shut out from useful content. So that is sort of the ultimate extreme example. What is likely to happen, more likely to happen, is what we call the balkanization of the internet. In many cases, particularly for the poor countries where the audiences that are generated are not of great value, what we are likely to see is the networks where the content is hosted will say it's not worth our while to enter into negotiations, make payments, do settlements, do all these complicated things. We simply won't pay. That means we simply will not provide content to those countries. I think some of you have seen that with certain kinds of content, it says not available for the country that you are accessing from. I have seen it at least since I live in Sri Lanka. So we are likely to see a situation where content will be available for those in the United States, perhaps those in Europe, but not those in South Asia, not those in Africa, and so on. A balkanization of what was a very universal meta medium, as I like to call it. The internet is more than a medium, it's a whole platform, a whole plethora of media. So this is a sad situation. This is a frightening or scary prospect for us living and working in the developing countries. And we hope that the governments of the world will think about the young children who want to access content like Salkan's khanacademy.org, or even their citizens who get a lot of enjoyment and manage their social relations through services like Facebook, to think about their people rather than the profits of the European telephone companies, and to vote these kinds of absurd proposals out at the December WICET conference in Dubai. Thank you.